What is up, my peepholes? This is your guy, Kalai, and welcome back to Budget Buys with a side order of DIY. Today, I'm going to be talking about resin molds, specifically dice resin molds. I found these little guys on AliExpress of all places, and that's kind of big news, because until recently, if you wanted to get your hands on pre-made dice molds, you had to go onto Etsy or similar websites where you'd end up getting a mold like this one for about $20 per mold, and you need 7 of those to make a dice set. Now, you might get lucky and find a seller willing to do a package deal where you can get all 7 molds for $100, but that's still $100. And that's been a big barrier of entry for a lot of people that want to get into this hobby. Now, of course, I'm not trying to throw shade on the people selling the dice molds because I understand what goes into it. I mean, heck, I made these dice molds myself. At the end of the day, that price really isn't for the materials that are used in making the mold. Instead, you're paying for the seller's time as well as their specialized tools and knowledge. Heck, the mold I just showed you only used up about $1 to $2 worth of silicone, and if you wanted a translucent mold like these, you're going to be paying about $2 to $3 for the silicone. And yes, there is a point to making the molds translucent because not only does that allow you to see what's going on inside if you're doing a complicated design, but it also allows you to use UV curing resin. So keep that in mind. I can tell you firsthand that it is an extremely tedious process to prepare your dice for making the mold, to cut the dice out of the silicone once everything's cured, especially if you don't want to ruin your master dice in the process. And if you want to ensure that the molds are bubble-free, you're going to need to use a pressure pot or vacuum chamber, neither of which is cheap. Now that I've ranted a little bit about the pricing structure of pre-made molds as well as what goes into making them yourself, let's talk about how much I paid for these. Would you believe about $1 each? Now on AliExpress, there are 3 different ways that I've come across to get your hands on these molds. The first option is to buy them individually for about $1 to $2 each, depending on the seller you go with. And if you're willing to wait 1 to 2 months to get your hands on these molds, there are some sellers that offer free shipping. Otherwise, you're going to be paying about $3 in order to get them in 2 to 3 weeks. Of course, I don't know if all of these sellers combine shipping on the molds, so you might end up paying $4 per mold, and that is less than ideal. Fortunately, there are sellers that offer the entire 7-piece set for about $5 plus the $3 shipping that I mentioned earlier. I have yet to come across a seller that offers free shipping on these, but they're bound to pop up at some point. There's also the option that I went with, which was the 19-piece set for $11 plus $3 shipping. So I paid about $14 for this entire set of molds, and it took about 3 weeks to arrive. And I bet some of you just got confused because I said 19 pieces, and 19 isn't cleanly divisible by 7. It would make more sense if I said I got the 14-piece set or the 21-piece set. So what's up with that? And the truth is, I got 19 completely different molds. And not only did I get the standard 7-piece set that includes the D4, D6, D8, D10, D10 percentile, D12, and D20, but I also got a D6 with pips, a Fudge Dye, which for those of you who have no idea what this is, it's a D6 with 2 blank faces, 2 plus faces, and 2 minus faces used in the Fudge RPG system as well as the Fate RPG system and all of their derivatives because they're on the open game license. There's also this really oddly shaped die, which believe it or not, it's meant to be a D10, a D24, a massive D6 with a blank face with a dot, as well as the letters A through D, a massive D20 that has a selection of letters on it that's used for a board game that I can't quite remember. I know it's used for a board game because I found a ruined copy of it one time while dumpster diving and decided to keep the D20. If you know what game this comes from, let me know down in the comments below. Last but not least, there is the oversized partial dice set. And I say partial because it includes the D4, D6, D8, D10, D12, and D20. And for those of you wondering, no, I will not be testing all of these molds out in this video because I don't have the resin budget for it. However, if you stick around, I will show you a standard die set that I made using these molds. Now before I show you what the dice out of these molds look like, let's take a moment to focus on how they work. As you can see, these are two-part molds, and the cap has a little bit of extra silicone extending around the edge, as well as a little tab. And what you do with this is you slide it underneath this lip here, like so. Give a little bit of a tug and a squeeze, and you can get everything set the way you need, and it's ready to fill. Let's just center that up, though it's not mandatory. And I've got to admit, the inclusion of that tab is a great design decision because in a lot of cases, you don't want the base getting rotated, especially in the case of a D4. Because while it won't really affect the other dice in a dice set, on a D4, it can render it completely unusable. As for how you fill these molds, you could try using them as squish molds where you fill them up and then put the cap on top. But personally, I prefer to use the center fill hole with either a pipette, a syringe, or the weird syringe pipette hybrid that I showed you in my pumpkin spice dice video. Anyway, let's move on to the part a lot of you came here for and show you what the dice out of these molds look like. Okay, I'm not gonna lie, I absolutely love how these turned out, but it wasn't exactly a painless process. In fact, there are a couple of flaws inherent in these molds that made me nearly lose this entire dice set. Though, as you can see, I was able to save them. It just means I'm posting this video a little bit later than intended. Now, the main issue with these molds is right here. This is the hole that you use to get your resin into the mold, and it's a bit on the large side. Now, while that's great for when you're injecting your resin, since it allows the air in the mold to flow outwards and helps mitigate air bubbles, it's going to add a good bit of time to your sanding schedule. Typically, what I do when making my own molds is use a toothpick to make my injection point, and the end result is a nice narrow sprue that can be easily snipped or sanded off. But it takes a bit longer with this chonker right here. Even worse, it's not the biggest one in the set. Also, I should point out that there is no reservoir on these molds, and that means that if you're like me and you use a viscous resin in a pressure pot, make darn sure there's no air bubbles in your resin. Otherwise, you might end up doing what I did and have to rescue your dice. Because when I pulled them out of the pressure pot the first time, there was a huge divot where all of the resin receded, and that does not make for a good final product. Fortunately, as you can see, I was able to save these by doing a secondary injection, but I would honestly prefer not having to do that, which is where these reservoirs come in very handy. Put a little extra resin in there and everything fills in as it pressurizes. Now, the next time I use these molds, what I'm going to try to do is build up my own reservoir using hot glue, because the hot glue should get close enough to the silicone to form a seal so that the resin doesn't seep out when everything's pressurized. But at the same time, silicone doesn't stick to anything but silicone, so I'll be able to remove it when everything's done and the mold will be no worse for wear. The other big issue I encountered with these molds has to do with the D4 itself, because this base is very narrow. If you're going to put it inside of a pressure pot like I did, make sure to surround it with other molds, because if you jostle the pressure pot while sealing it, it's going to tip over, and you'd rather not have that happen with uncured resin inside. Just a little heads up. Now that I've got my main critiques out of the way, let's move on to something that I bet some of you were hoping to see, and that's a demolding. Because I mixed up a little bit too much resin when I was making this set, and as such, I ended up casting a D24. And demolding these things is actually really simple. All you've got to do is first take off any excess resin at the top here. Next, open it up. Peel out the cap, like so, and then wring it out. Fortunately, these molds are extremely durable and pop back in shape no problem. An added advantage of these being so cheap is the fact that it will wear out eventually. You're probably going to get maybe 30 or so uses out of these, but it's $1 to replace. Now, before I move on any further, let's just take a closer look at this freshly demolded D24. And as you can see, I wasn't kidding when I said the sprue was a bit on the chunky side. Also, there is a bit of flaring where the cap was, but fortunately, it's not really that hard to sand it down because the other sides act as a nice flat sanding guide. Also, I just noticed this when I was shooting this part, but the 12 and 14 are actually off-center in order to make up for the additional volume used on this face. I just thought that was kind of neat. And if you need any further proof that it's going to sand down nice and cleanly, let's just take a look at the D20 because it had a bit of that issue when it came to the one face. I honestly thought I was going to end up losing detail on the 13, 7, and 19 here, but as you can see, it looks really nice when sanded. The extra bit of material actually went all the way to the base of these numerals, so I was pleasantly surprised when everything turned out oh so pretty. Now that I've got the bad parts of these molds out of the way, let me go ahead and sing their praises. Because at the end of the day, I absolutely love these things. Not only are these molds insanely cost effective, like I mentioned earlier, but they're also incredibly easy to use, as long as you know about the issues I mentioned earlier. Also, thanks to the incredibly sharp profile on these dice and the fact that the mold lines only take up a single face, you're going to have a very easy time cleaning these up, despite the added sanding needed for the extra wide sprue. Getting the mold lines to affect a single face like that is incredibly difficult when making your own molds, though sometimes you might get lucky like I did with this D4 mold, and other times you won't be so lucky and you'll end up having your seam run through a number just like I did here. In fact, I like this mold design so much that I'm using it as a basis for some of the custom master dice that I'm getting ready to 3D print. Originally, I was just going to print custom dice and then make a mold using this method, but I've been converted. I'll just be sure to include a reservoir in my final mold design. Speaking of masters, that is a huge advantage this mold set has over all of the other ones I've seen online. While there are people out there that 3D print their own masters and then make molds from those, most people are going to be using retail dice because they're much more readily available. The downside to that is they're typically processed and tumbled, which removes material, rounds the edges, and so on and so forth, and the final result will be dice like these. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, you have to be very careful when processing these because you can change up the geometry significantly since they were processed prior to you making a mold out of them. Also, sharp-edged dice are incredibly in right now, and if you wanted to make those from these, you're going to be losing a significant amount of material. Of course, there are other options when it comes to making sharp-edged dice, like using game science dice, which are lauded as being untumbled and straight from the factory, and admittedly usually come without their numbers inked. Or you can use metal dice like these that were kindly sent to me by Paladin Roleplaying. But neither of those scenarios can hold a candle to the quality of dice you get out of molds made straight from a master. And now for a jarring cut because I have a last-minute addition to this video. While I was doing a little last-minute research on these molds, I saw a few customer reviews of these on AliExpress, and some people are saying that these molds look pretty much identical to the dice made by Dispel. And after taking a closer look myself, I'm going to say they are indeed very similar. However, that doesn't really change my opinion on these molds, because as I mentioned earlier, most of the molds on the market are made from retail dice. But those are made by somebody pouring silicone around the existing die, and these molds are obviously injection molded in 2 parts. Heck, if you take a closer look, you can even see the seam line on these molds, and that means that these were made using masters that were purpose-built for making molds. Admittedly, there is still the slight possibility that somebody got their hands on the masters that Dispel uses to make their molds, but it's more likely that the manufacturers of these molds are using either the same font or a font in the same family. And I've done enough research on fonts for my channel art and thumbnails to tell you that it's a bit of a gray area there. Because it's very easy to find fonts that are free for commercial use that are near identical to the ones that'll cost you an arm and a leg to use on your products. And of course, the sharp-edged regular solids used to make most of these dice are very easy to make in whichever 3D modeling program you want to use. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out before wrapping this video up in case that will influence your opinion, but like I said, it doesn't really influence mine. The existence of these molds still makes this hobby infinitely more accessible than it was just a couple months ago. Now back to our regularly scheduled video. So, If you like what you saw here and would like to get your hands on some of these molds, I'm going to go ahead and leave some affiliate links down in the description below, both for AliExpress, where I originally picked up these molds, as well as for Amazon, because they're slowly making their way to Amazon's fulfillment warehouses, and I happened to come across the 19 mold set available on Amazon Prime with 2-day shipping for around $19 or $20, which is not much more than what I paid for these, and you don't have to wait 3 weeks. And I'm also going to keep an eye out for the 7-piece set on Amazon and add that as a pinned comment when that becomes available. I know it's already available on Amazon if you're willing to wait for international shipping, but at that point it's not much different from ordering from AliExpress. And on that note, I think I'm going to go polish up a D24, so until next time, this is your guy Cly, signing off.